Marvel characters have been around for so long at this point with minimal reboots that you can almost trace the daily life of any random character over the course of several years in-universe. This is a blessing and a curse in that these characters persist so long that you feel like you can really get to know them, but you also have a harder time letting go of the times when their characters are broken or drastically changed. Long-form comic storytelling has a sort of status quo that's very hard to change or manipulate. Aside from smaller details here and there, most of our favorite four-color comic characters are doing pretty much the same thing they were doing nearly a century ago, because that's what fans expect of them. Spider-Man's still a young nobody with money problems and girl troubles. Batman's still a billionaire sad man who collects lonely children and trains them to punch. And Superman is still working at the Daily Planet. Sure, they branched off and did completely different stuff like getting married, having their secret identities go public, and dying! But it doesn't really stick because they're too popular to change now. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the Spider-Man villain no writer seems to know what to do with. The Lizard! Or more specifically, how the character has been narratively frozen for nearly 60 years, unable to make any substantial character progress like some of his counterparts. And maybe along the way we can figure out why certain comic characters have such a hard time getting any true development, and end up spinning their wheels forever with repetitive stories and arcs that never go anywhere.
What is it? A lizard? Or a man? I'm a lizard man.
This video topic was picked for the $100 tier on my Patreon by Christian Kellum. This is a weirdly specific video topic that I'm not sure will have an audience, but after a long time pondering it, I think it could be interesting to discuss one of Spidey's oldest foes, and how in a broader sense, comics are almost universally unchanging. So let's give it a try. The Lizard is a scientist by the name of Curt Connors, a brilliant geneticist who lost his arm while serving in the military, or in a car accident, or a lawnmower mishap, or something. Studying the way some lizards regrow lost appendages, he injects himself with a serum that restores his arm, and turns him into a giant monster that eats people and tries to destroy society by making people into lizards. He's most well known for his role as the main villain in that movie where Andrew Garfield stutters and looks hot. And you may remember his brief cameos in those other movies where Tobey Maguire mumbles and has the jackedest abs you ever done seen. But I personally prefer the classic portrayal of him by Rob Zombie. Look it up, that's real.
Parker, what the hell are you doing?
He's one of Spidey's oldest and most recognizable villains, due in no small part to the fact that every cartoon or game series takes a shot at adapting him. As such, he's one of the ones that stuck around the longest because Stan and Steve were on a hot streak and just couldn't seem to come up with a bad villain at the time, creating this wave of memorable characters that people can't get enough of, except maybe Mendel Stromm, but whatever. His characterization over the years has remained pretty consistent, portraying him as a Jekyll and Hyde archetype. Brilliant scientist just trying to keep his life together, giant monster that wrecks shit and tries to destroy society. My biggest issue with that characterization overall is that he's just really similar to... he has the same conflicts and trait... He's the Hulk, he's just the Hulk. Split personality, permanent involuntary changes, damaged personal relationships, the whole 9 yards. Which is fine because that's like a cool character, and he's more of a recurring side character than like the main protagonist of anything. But over the years, there's only so much you can do with that setup for a villain. First he's cured, then he's not, then his family leaves him, then they're back, then he can control it, then he can't again. Just round and round with that status quo. He never really gets anywhere, which is also fine because I guess life can be like that for some people. The frustration with the Lizard comes from when a good writer tries to shake things up, completely annihilates the status quo and does something really interesting, then it doesn't take. In Paul Jenkins' awesome Spectacular Spider-Man run, he made strides to really reinvent Spidey villains and try new things. He arguably created the idea that Shocker is a bumbling comic relief guy that's just down on his luck, which other writers have adopted and added to since then. He tried to fix Venom's busted-ass character motivations by giving a better reason for Eddie hating Spider-Man, which was the suit being the only thing keeping his terminal cancer from killing him, and he had to just keep feeding the symbiote his hate so it wouldn't abandon him and let him die. Oh, that was retconned? Come on, Donnie, that was a good one! Oh, you know I can't stay mad at you, sweet prince. That Carnage event made up for it. Hell, this run even had Spidey and Green Goblin sharing a calm moment or two and making a truce. Lots of new ideas for character dynamics. Paul Jenkins also took a stab at rebuilding Dr. Connors and the Lizard in A Lizard's Tale, where we find Kurt struggling to make ends meet after his wife's death due to sickness from industrial pollution in that one comic that everyone memes on for the reboot art style. It's sad that that comic looks the way it does because the story is actually pretty good if you can tolerate the art. Anyway, Doc tries to get a research grant to get his life as a single dad back on track, but a rival scientist takes home the prize instead. Then Kurt turns into a giant scaly monster and attempts to murder him. Spidey swings in and stops him, takes him to a safe place, and for some reason Kurt knows Peter's identity. Like, this was never established anywhere, he just does now. Alright, I guess. He goes on this long spiel about how hard it is being trapped in the body of a monster and not having control of himself, and how it's also somewhat freeing to just be a dumb lizard. Later in the story, Peter tells Kurt some distressing news about the press having images of Kurt transforming, though his face isn't visible. This sends Kurt into a rage where he transforms and then, for some reason, this is played like a big reveal. The recap page for the next issue says this transformation seems deliberate, but I didn't get that vibe at all. He starts changing when he gets terrible news and passes out in a pool of water while he's so weak he can't finish saying a sentence to Peter. And then Peter's like, "It was you all along," and now Lizard's character is permanently tainted. The implication now is that his mental faculties don't go away when he's the Lizard. He doesn't swap out into a separate personality, the change is purely physical, and he's been faking it the entire time. For years. He pretends to be a mindless monster with crazy plans and an insatiable bloodlust. There's a good 20 or so stories that make no sense now, but hey, it's character development. The cycle of repetition is over. This was an even bigger change than killing off his wife Martha. Her death had potential, but I could foresee all that changing is that now no one's there to wait in the house with Billy Connors while Spidey wrangles the Beast for the upteenth time. It's one of those inconsequential character changes like Carnage getting a new symbiote from the Negative Zone or Vulture having cancer. It ultimately changes nothing because the situations and character motivations are generally the same. It's just a cliff note in the Wikipedia article or a linkless red name. After being confronted with the truth that Kurt is just mentally ill and uses the Lizard as a big excuse to act out and cause chaos when he's depressed, Kurt decides to get himself locked up Michael Scofield style and stay in prison where the world's safe from his bullshit. It's not the best thought out retcon Jenkins made in his run, nor is it even the most entertaining, but it's an interesting take nonetheless. It made the Lizard less of a stereotype and opened the door for so many new stories you could tell with that villain. The status quo was changed. Soon after, Lizard shows up again in Marvel Knights Spider-Man number 7, and he's just a big dumb animal, and Spidey beats him up in 2 pages. Then he returns in another book, where he's not in prison, and his son still lives with him. Then he goes nuts along with every other animal-themed character in New York, and turns his son into a second Lizard. Lizard Jr., if you will. This is ignored in a few of the following stories. A few appearances later, his son is in a foster home, he's trying to get custody of him, and then he kidnaps him. We see inner monologues from Kurt and the Lizard, who is a separate voice in his head, which officially deconfirms everything from Lizard's Tale and makes that whole story a pointless mess. But you can't say it's non-canon and didn't happen because Billy Connors was separated from his father after his criminal charges. And the Lizard has never been to jail before that because Spidey always protected his identity and brought him home after an episode. What I'm getting at here is that the Lizard is in a weird subsection of characters in terms of popularity. He's not important enough that you can't, make drastic changes to him every once in a while and do some experimental stuff, but he's too important to have those changes be permanent because the general readers all know the same basic idea of him. Sad scientist, involuntary transformation into a monster, his family is worried about him. He's not like Moon Knight, where no one cares and every run completely reinvents the character. That's going to change after the TV show comes out. But then in the same story entitled Shed, Lizard's so riled up that he kills and eats Billy Connors. This is another big moment where the character could be changed forever. Kurt Connors is so traumatized by this event that he completely recedes into his own mind, and stays in some kind of humanoid, intelligent form of the Lizard for multiple storylines. Then he's back to being Kurt again. Then his son and wife get revived as clones. But they're partially spliced with lizard DNA, and they look a little bit scaly, and they're mutant people now, and they live in the sewers. Every third or fourth appearance of the lizard, the writers do something drastic to the status quo of the character in order to keep him interesting, but then over those 2 or 3 appearances in the middle, it's either forgotten about or softly undone. The lizard, like many Marvel characters, is in a weird paradoxical position, where they have to keep evolving to stay relevant since casual fans do know about them. But they can't change too much or it'll alienate those casual fans and become confusing. It's like when they killed off Kraven the Hunter only for him to be revived via magic, and then kill himself again, leaving behind a clone that's been aged to his mid-20s so he's in his prime and can just continue the legacy. We had this big important ending for the character, but now he's basically back and it's like he never left. The lizard is stuck in an infinite loop, and I can guarantee he'll find a cure for his family in one of his appearances soon, just so they can be right back at zero again. That family is so cursed with being stuck in the same state that Billy Connors is the only kid in Spider-Man comics who hasn't aged. Harry Osborn's son went from a newborn baby to 10 years old in the same time it took Billy to go from 10 to 13. He should be in his 20s by this point. Even Venom was able to have a son that's now at least 10. And that too, I can only guess, is something that won't stay around for long. He'll probably die or get adopted and forgotten about for 20 years after he served his purpose in this story. Because the status quo for Venom is not a reporter with an alien parasite that's also a dad. I'd like to make a side note that giving a violent anti-hero character a random child they didn't know about to force them to be more responsible is happening way too often. Deadpool has a daughter, Moon Knight is a dad now. I called that twist with Dylan Brock the second I saw his face. Heck, they even did it in an issue of Punisher Max a little bit. Hey, even the movie Logan did it. It's like everyone's allowed to be a dad except Spider-Man. And all of these cheap character development bastard children are disposable and temporary. Deadpool already forgot about his. Like literally forgot. He used drugs to erase his memory. With any story that runs this long, you have to make changes to your characters to keep them fresh and interesting. Much like a long-running TV series or webcomic, it's a story that can't have a definitive end, so firm conclusions are few and far between. But there's certainly exceptions to the rule where long-form storytelling can embrace a drastic change in status quo and make it work. Some good examples from TV are The Good Place, which completely throws its premise out the window after the first season for a shocking twist and just rolls with it. Or even that animated show Archer, where the secret agent parody was running a little thin, and the fictional agency had a really unfortunate name that real-life circumstances forced them to change. So they just take those same characters and every season throw them somewhere new and different and see what kind of action and comedy comes of it. Comics don't often do something like this, and big pot-stirring moments that alter the story are used mostly to keep the sales up instead of servicing said story. It gets readers invested when they learn that the normal everyday life of their favorite hero or villain is about to be disrupted in a crazy way. It makes for some really great attention-grabbing clickbait headlines, or maybe a really wacky cover for the issue that sells particularly well. But these major changes don't stay for long. They're an easily reversible gimmick. It takes an insane amount of work, care, and persistence to make any big character growth stay. That's not to say it never happens. The depressed loner Batman one day decided to take on a ward and basically became the adoptive father of a whole pantheon of kids, meaning he's not really as lonely as we all used to think he is. Spider-Man was even able to grow up beyond his teenage superhero shtick and is now a functional adult who pays his own bills. And he was the original teen superhero before all these other copycats. Granted, both of those examples happened in the 40s and 60s before these characters became too popular for their own good. I suppose Hank Pym isn't popular enough to keep stagnant. He's Ultron now, and that's been around for quite a while. I hope that sticks. You could say it happened with Venom slowly but surely. He stopped being a poorly written, edgy 90s Spider-Man villain and started being a sci-fi horror-themed anti-hero that Spidey considers a friend. Magneto is no longer the violent terrorist supervillain that he used to be, and now is a cherished ally and friend of the X-Men to honor the legacy of Professor X, who will come back to life as soon as the Marvel Studios movie comes out, and Magneto will become evil again because brand synergy. Geez, I'm not helping my point, but it happens. Sometimes. Yet, in the case of characters like the Lizard, you can't help but feel bad about how it's always the same old problems on repeat with brief intermissions of something unique before it all snaps back into place. It's a special no-win scenario for creatives when they're making these characters, because you run the risk of breaking a character someone else created decades ago and stamping on their ideas, or by making a change that's so permanent and airtight that the next guy feels creatively stifled because he can't change it. If you just write whatever you want, fans be damned, it's easy to completely alienate your audience and destroy their interest in the story. If you write solely based on whatever the fans want, it turns into a shallow mess of fan service and nostalgia baiting with no clear direction. I'm not sure what solution there is here, what position to take, because it's such a complicated problem. Lizard syndrome is a flaw that sort of comes with the territory for this creative medium. Though sometimes I see example of lizard syndrome in other art mediums, where storytellers are so pressured by massive, almost religiously devout fandoms that they have to play it incredibly safe and try to keep the series fresh by taking risks. It's a clumsy tightrope walk that few can make it across, usually leaving this middling effect where growth happens but doesn't matter 5 minutes later. Take Star Wars, for example. They pulled a major plot twist in the second movie of this new trilogy by killing off the main villain, completely throwing out expectations of the series just rehashing the old movies. Then that twist left a very vocal set of fans feeling dissatisfied and disappointed and discouraged and disjointed. And here we are with a sequel to retcon Snoke into being like just a puppet. Like a literal meat puppet possessed by the fan favorite villain who is behind everything, even though that makes zero sense. The fandom hated a major change, so the writers panicked and undid it, making the whole thing feel even less satisfying. I know a lot of people are up in arms about the Palpatine situation, but this sort of thing happens on a weekly basis if you're reading comic books. In fact, this may as well have been the ending of the Clone Saga, where they just said, "Oh, yeah, Norman Osborn is behind everything, even though we killed him off decades ago. Let's wrap this up because we wrote ourselves into a corner." Fans are nearly impossible to please, but that doesn't stop writers from trying their best to do it anyway, with varying results. I'd like to open up the conversation to you, the viewer, and ask, what do you think would be the best way to work around this lizard syndrome problem, so that both creators and the fans can be happy, while still letting heroes and villains evolve organically and try new things? Is there an answer to this paradox? Hell, maybe you're a writer at Marvel listening to this and you've just been inspired to try your own method. Either way, good old Kirk Connors is here to stay, and he's far from the worst case of repetitive characters in comics. But a part of me does wish that the guy could finally get a proper happy ending.